My name is Steve, and this is the LabKey Workflow Module webinar. This is a new module for LabKey, and it allows you to model complex processes, especially processes with lots of steps and branchings and different players involved. I'm going to hand it over to Susan, who was the main dev for this feature, so take it away, Susan.
All right, thanks, Steve. So yes, I'm going to introduce you to this relatively new module for incorporating workflows into your LabKey server. Of course, LabKey has supported workflows of various types for a long time. And so I'm going to touch on the modules that you might already be familiar with, and then contrast that with the new module and its capabilities. So my goals in this presentation are just twofold. One is to help you to decipher what types of LabKey workflows you might need. And then the bulk of the time will be spent on the new module and how do you actually begin programming with the workflow module and what are its capabilities, which I will illustrate through lots of examples. So just to give you an idea of how this talk will flow, so we started with the timer, and now we're at the overview. And then, as I said, I'm going to go over the different types of workflows that are currently supported in LabKey, and that will be illustrated with a couple of demos on my local server. And then I will introduce the business process workflows and their capabilities, and also show you a couple of examples of those in action, and then talk about the workflow module and programming with the workflow module itself. And then if there are any questions, well, if you have any, then we'll just start over again at the beginning. And if you don't, then that'll be the end. I'm kidding, of course. As Steve said, we can take questions as you have them, although we may wait to answer them until the end. But please ask questions as they occur to you. Okay, so the first type of workflow that you might be familiar with is a data workflow that LabKey supports. And this is with two of the modules, the data integration module and the pipeline module. And this is for transformations of data or working with data. So the data integration module implements what's known as an extract transform load or ETL, which takes data from one source and then possibly transforms it and then inserts it into another source, the LabKey database. And that can be incorporated with a pipeline job as well. So the flow for that looks something like this, as implemented in LabKey, but also just a general ETL. So it can be started either based on a timing parameter that you've set up, so started on a schedule, or a person can start it manually. And then the process takes over. It will, according to the configurations that you've set up, extract the data from one source and possibly transform it or not. It could just be an extract and load. And all the while, it does the logging of what is going on so that you can keep track of where the data is and what problems might have happened, and where success or what the state of your data is. So I will just switch to a quick example of an ETL project. So you see up here, it's just a project that has some data in a demographics table. And then there is one data transformation configuration in this module, which will take data from the demographics table and then extract certain subset of it and put it into the patients table. So you can see that there is this schedule. You can set it up to run every hour. It's currently disabled. Or I can manually kick this off. And then we see the logging that's happening. This one isn't very complicated, so there's not a lot in the log, but now that the ETL is complete, if we go back to the workspace, now we see that the patient's data has been populated. We extracted data for a particular treatment group and gender. So that's just a small example of what you can do with the data transformation module that exists in LabKey. And the key indicators for using this module or the pipeline module is that it's for a data workflow. You have just data that you want to get from one place to another, or possibly you have a long-running or complex processing steps that you want to do, and so a person doesn't want to sit at the computer and do that. It's useful for normalizing data from different systems, or, as I pointed out, moving data in scheduled increments, and it helps to log and audit the migration processes. So that's just a brief overview of data integration and pipeline jobs. Another example of workflows that have been supported for a long time in LabKey are with the issues module, so the issue tracker. And this flow, in contrast to the data integration flow, involves people. And the general flow is that a person will create and assign an issue, and enter a lot of parameters about, here's the issue and here's the area, and then the person that it is assigned to will take that data that you've entered in the form, work on it, and then resolve the issue. At which point the original requester will be notified, and they can make a decision just based on whatever was logged in the issue itself, whether they want to verify and close the issue, or perhaps reopen the issue, and then it goes back to the person who was originally assigned it, or perhaps somebody else. So this issue tracker has been in LabKey for a long time, and we continue to improve it and make it more general purpose. So let me just show you an example of simple example of a request list for, I've called this assay requests. So I can make a new request, call this run my assays, and I will assign it to someone. It's an assay request, external distribution, lab A, and all of these, many of these form fields are customizable. They're things that I added specifically for my type of request. Some of them are fixed, and they'll be with any kind of issue. But I can say the responsible scientist and choose a sample and choose the type of assay. And then I can also indicate who should be notified. Give details about what I want people to do, and then I make my request. And And so if I go back to my request list, here's the new request that I made. And as I mentioned, these the fields that are available here are customizable if you have the proper permissions, which I do. And so this just gives you a sense for what that looks like. So you can indicate what kind of issue it is. You know, it doesn't have to be an issue all the time. It can be, in this case, I made a request, and what users should be attached to this group of lists, and then you can add and remove fields, and give them a different ordering. So all of that makes for a pretty general purpose way to make requests, but as I mentioned, this is for human processes. So there are people involved, and the people have to know when I resolve this issue. Oops, if I resolve this issue or I update it, then I'm the one who decides who it goes to, which is great if that's if the people in your lab or your institution have a workflow that they know, and they can just use this as a tool for recording the steps. So this is just a summary of the features for the issue tracker. Human processes, customizable forms for defining sets of parameters of a request, and one of the nice things about it is that the grid that you see is just a standard LabKey grid of data, and so you can do all sorts of filtering and analysis and customizing of views and all of that just by virtue of the fact that it is a LabKey data grid. So in contrast to that, we have the business process workflows. And the reason that we introduced this module was we recognized that there are many more complex processes out there that the current modules don't really meet the needs of. And this is it's based on a standard called BPMN, Business Process Model and Notation. And we wanted to enable the more general purpose incorporation of, as you see here, we can combine system steps, which are the steps that have the little gear icon, with also human participation, which are the icons with the little person in the corner. And you don't need to worry about what this workflow is actually doing. It's just an example of some of the complexity that you can have. So I will start out by just summarizing what the workflow module itself is good for. It can be used for for the simple human processes, but generally, if the work involves both system tasks and human tasks, that's a good indication that you might want the workflow module. Or if there are decision points within the flow that a program can be made to do that automatically, that's also a good indication. Or the flow potentially involves parallel tasks. So there are multiple things that you want to have going on at once. Or maybe there are repeating tasks or tasks that have time limits or activation times. All of those things are possible with the new workflow module. So as I mentioned, it's standards-based BPMN 2.0, which was designed for representing business processes. That's an important distinction to make, because it is not intended to represent data flow like we have for the ETL. You can incorporate a data flow as part of your business process, but the BPMN notation itself doesn't represent that. And we'll see an example of that a little bit later on. And so the reason for the development of this standard was as a way to make the process more readily understandable by business stakeholders. And we have found it useful not only for programmatically, but just for communicating, this is the flow that we have in mind. Is this what you intend or not? So we'll start out with a simple example of a workflow. And this one has just two steps, really. There's someone who requests an export, which starts the workflow, and then a person will handle that request and decide whether to grant the request or not, and then the requester can download the data set or not. So the little X here in the middle represents what's called an exclusive gateway, which means that one or the other of those branches will be followed, but not both. And then we also implemented for the handling of data permissions handlers. This builds off of the existing LabKey permissions infrastructure, but is a registry that's specific to the workflow module, so that you can indicate who would be a candidate for handling one of these tasks, and who can, for example, download the data set. It should be the original requester and no one else. We expanded on that workflow to add in some email notification. So you remember the issues tracker, you can specify people to be notified when things change in an issue. We incorporated that also in the workflow module, so that there's 3 points in the workflow now where notifications will go out. And when the original request happens, and then as a result of the decision about whether you can approve, where you can download the data set or not. Further expansion of that workflow, we added data management and timers, and then you can also have event listeners. So the data management is when the request happens, we create a data set that is being requested for download, and then we, depending on the flow within this process, we need to update the security policy or remove the data set. The workflow process also, you can attach timers to various tasks. In this case, we added an expiration timer because the request is only valid for a certain amount of time. Excuse me. And then you can also attach event listeners throughout the process. You might, for example, want to know when any one of these processes is finished. So we have capabilities for attaching event listeners. And then here's another example in which we've added what are known as boundary events. And those are, sorry. The boundary events are the little open circles that are attached to the side of tasks that interrupt that task. So, for example, in this workflow, we might decide that we've assigned a person to do a task, but actually we don't need that to happen. So we remove the abstractor, and then our flow continues to the next decision point. And then this flow also illustrates that you can have processes with multiple entry points. So the open circles are the entry points, and the little message there indicates that little envelope icon indicates that it's a message, which you might think that's an email, but it's not. It is an indication that we are starting at a particular point that the workflow is listening on. You can also have, as I mentioned at the beginning, you might have a workflow that uses parallel tasks. So the little plus icon there is a parallel gateway where at that point you've launched N different tasks that are that can happen at the same time, and then the plus at the end indicates that you will wait for all of those tasks to finish before moving on. And you can also have conditional parallel tasks. So the open circle diamond is an indication of an inclusive gateway in the BPMN language, which means that you test the conditions. You don't automatically start N. You see which of the branches are satisfied, and then start that many different processes. And that can be still one or more, but there are different tests for which branches to follow. And again, you wait at the end before proceeding to the next step. And then one nice thing, as I mentioned, the BPMN notation is good as a communication tool, so it allows you to have annotations within the diagrams as well. So now I'm going to switch over to an actual example that that uses one of these workflows, and this was so we saw this briefly before. This is our document extraction with natural language processing workflow. So let me just switch over to that project. And this is an example of a project that incorporates pipeline as well as a workflow. So the pipeline is used to get documents into the system, and then those documents are meant to be reviewed and worked on by various people, and that's where the workflow is involved, and who is going to do various tasks within that flow. And then the document, the workflow, let me go back to, so the workflow starts with a system task, which is automatic task assignment, and this can be, this is driven by a set of configurations that you set up in your project to determine for the documents that come in, how many of them should be automatically assigned, how many of them should be assigned by a person, and this can be based on the information that you get from the documents that come into the system. And then, depending on those parameters, this is the process will determine whether additional assignment is needed. And so it may go to a person to do assignment or not. And then if there is a person who needs to act on the document, it will go to one of these other manual tasks in the process. So just to show you, so if I show you this. So this is the input data for that first system task. It tells you, what kind of documents does this configuration apply to, and then what % of documents that come into the system should be assigned to a person for abstraction, what % to assign for review, how many should be assigned for review if they were abstracted by the natural language processing engine, and so on. So if this is the step that would be handled by without human interaction usually, but I will just do this manually. I want to process one of these documents, and sorry about that. So now that processing is complete, and if I go down to my abstraction task list here, you will see the set of documents that have come through the system and are either waiting for me to act on them in one way or another. So I am someone who has permissions for all the different types of tasks in this particular workflow. So I am an administrator, which means that I can assign a task. So if I assign this to the abstractor, and then I can impersonate that so if I impersonate the abstractor, then the abstraction task list shows the set of tasks that person needs to act upon. But since the abstractor doesn't have, say, administrative permissions, they don't have a task list for assigning tasks. And then the abstractor can work on their particular task list, and when they're done with that, it moves on to the next step automatically. So if the abstractor decides that is done, now their task list is smaller, and the reviewer now has another task to do. So that is an example of an application that uses the standard LabKey look and feel for showing you a set of tasks of various types that you can that you may need to act on. We also have the other workflow that I was using before for this export request. This was incorporated into a different application and with very custom UI. So I'm going to walk you through that just with screenshots because I don't have that running on my machine. But this is for requesting data. So person would be on the screen that shows a set of data grids, and they want to export one of these data grids to be used outside of the system. So they click on request export, enter some parameters about why are they requesting this, because the process will require somebody to review the request. So you want to justify your request. You make the request, and then at this point we have gone through the process of creating the secured data set, or rather the machine has done that, and then notified the gatekeepers, as they're called. Um, so one of the notifications that you will get is through an email, but you also see here this little bell icon that was incorporated into the UI as another mechanism for notifying that something needs to be acted upon. So here you see a customized view of a task list. So these are all of the export requests that somebody needs to assign or act on. So if you go to one of the requests, you can then assign it to someone, and that person can then make a resolution whether they approve or deny the request. And at that point, since we approved it, we updated the security policy on the data set that was being requested so that the requester can now download it. And then we've notified the user who requested it so that they know it's available. And you'll see here that this is a view from the requester's view, but they now have a notification icon and an expiration date because the timer has started, indicating that you can download the data, but only for a certain amount of time. So those are just two examples of use of a workflow, and now I'm going to switch to talking a little bit about how we do this. The workflow engine that we use, that the workflow module encapsulates, comes from Activiti. They developed a BPMN platform that implements a large subset of the BPMN standard, not all of it, but we have not yet found something that we need that they don't have. And it is an embedded library and configurable with Spring, although we don't use that all that much. The workflow module provides a few things that are interesting for developers. One is the API portion of it, which provides a wrapper around the activity objects. And then also interfaces and base classes for various types of workflow activities or permissions handlers or system tasks and things like that. We'll see that a little more detail a little bit later. It also has the database component to it, so there is a workflow schema that is created in which all of the tables that Activiti uses are created. And then there are resources where in the workflow module itself, we have a couple of just generic workflow process definitions. But generally, if you are incorporating a workflow, you will put that resource in your own module. So as I mentioned, there are permissions handlers that you can register, and there's email notification, and there's system task runners, and boundary event handlers, and other things that you can use within the API. And we are expanding these as we have need for them. So before I go into more details about how you incorporate a workflow, if you wanted to start programming with a workflow, you need to review a little terminology. There is the process definition, which is sort of, it's the driver for everything. The diagrams that I've been showing you are illustrations of the process definition, but the actual process definition is written in XML. And one key part of this is the process definition key, and that is used as part of the name and is also referenced in the XML itself. But we use that, LabKey uses the key in order to find the the process definition file and in order to start it. So if you create a workflow, you deploy a new process definition, you create a workflow process, which will then start the workflow and start a new task. And then the workflow schema will be updated with the representation of the workflow process and the workflow task. You will almost certainly have some variables that are associated with your process, because otherwise it doesn't have a lot to act on. These are usually referenced in the XML itself. So there is definitely a tight coupling between the code that you may write and the XML process definition. Because, for example, to make the decision points work, you want to reference some kind of variable, or you can possibly reference just methods in the code. But usually it's referencing a variable that you define for the process. And those can also be used just in executing various tasks or showing UI for the tasks. So now I'm going to switch to this is just a simple example that I put together of a workflow definition, so we can see the various parts in action. And this uses, again, a standard rudimentary, really, UI that I just threw together. But this workflow has many of the interesting features that we've seen before. It has email notification. So you start the workflow process, my lab workflow process, by requesting that certain assays be run. And you can then, the process will notify the scientists that a request has been made. And then based on the input that you created the process, you will determine whether you're going to run one assay or both assays. No assays would not be very interesting. And then the run assay tasks both have these timer elements on them, which are used to put a time limit, not a time limit, but to notify the scientists if something gets delayed. So the assay has taken too long to run, then somebody should be notified so that they can go find out why, or maybe reassign the task to someone else. There are also the exclusive gateways that we've seen before, the inclusive gateway, where we will start one or more, and as mentioned, the timer boundary events. So to create a process, or to incorporate the workflow process, you need to create a process definition and then start a new workflow process. Creating the process definition, as I said, it's an XML file, and it will sit inside a module at a particular location. So the module, resources, workflow model, and then the name of the file. So for my example, I have my lab workflow module, resources workflow model, lab workflow. In order to do this, generally we are employing the Activiti Modeler that is a nice GUI for interacting with the workflow process definitions. You can, if you like, just create an XML file with a text editor, but that would be pretty tedious, and you wouldn't probably have the patience to generate the diagram. So we like, or at least I, like to use this the modeler that comes from Activiti, and there you can graphically produce your diagram and then export it as an XML file. And then from then on, I sort of switch back and forth between using the UI and using just a text editor to add, say, variables into the process. So once we have created the process definition, we create the XML file, and then within your code, you need to start a workflow process. So the workflow model API has a workflow service, which you can get from the service registry from LabKey, and then you set up your variables. This is just a small set of standard variables, but you will probably also want to attach some identifiers for objects that are being worked on within the workflow. And then you call start workflow. And you give it the module in which you are starting the workflow, the process key so that it can find it in that module, and then a description of the process and the variables and the container in which you are starting the workflow. So that's just a basic, you've started a workflow, and now you might want to enhance that by adding system task classes or registering a permissions handler or using the standard LabKey email templating system to register email templates for notifications. So to associate a system task class, this is done within the XML, and here we are employing some of the extensions that Activiti has provided for doing these service tasks, in that you can provide the name of the class that will handle the service task, and then within that XML element, you can also provide parameters for that class. So when you instantiate it, it knows more data about what kind of system task you want to run, for example. Permissions handlers, these are for you to incorporate, as I said, the standard LabKey permission structure into your workflow so that it has various different methods that you would implement for your particular process. There is a default permissions handler defined within the workflow module, but often you'll want to override that. So one method, for example, is for a particular task, who are the candidate users, or what are the permissions that a candidate user must have in order to perform that task. So that's one that you will probably want to override. And then there's who can view this workflow process, who can view this workflow task, and who can start a process. And then there are various other API methods that are available for you to use. Starting a process, removing a process, updating variables, and so on. And these can all be very useful as you are designing your workflow interface. So before I get to the things to remember, let me go back to my example here. So here you see a module that has this multiple assay workflow deployed to it. So this is the process diagram, and you'll see here reference to that process definition. And so if I look at the set of active processes, it shows that there have been requests made, and there are some that are active and can be acted upon, and some that are pending. And again, this interface that you're seeing now is what it's provided by the workflow module itself. So it is not customized in any way, and it might be fine for your purposes, but you know, often you're probably going to want to do some customization. This is the very basic API or UI that I've designed for starting the process. So I want to run a couple of assays, request a couple of assays. And here you see that this is the process that I just started. I have the 2 tasks that were created, and then these 2 jobs indicate the 2 timers that should notify a scientist if I have not assigned and finished the task within the next 2 minutes. And if I switch over here briefly to the mail record that I have on my system, you can see that there was an assay work request made, and the 2 people that I've designated as who to be notified would get just a simple email message saying, you know, somebody requested this, you should go work on it. And so then if I go back to my active processes, we'll see that these new elements came in, and they're not assigned to anyone, so they're waiting on someone to act on them. So if I go to run assay, I can assign it to someone, and then that person will get that task in their task list. Or I can reassign it to myself. And now it's in my tasks. So that's just an example of the workflow in action using the standard UI that comes from the workflow module. Often you will want to customize that, as we saw in a couple of the other examples. Okay, so very quickly here are some things to remember about working with the workflow. Is that the process definition is definitely part of the program, and there will be some back and forth between defining the process definition and incorporating that into your program. There are, as I mentioned, there are variables that you can attach to the workflow, but generally you want to keep a good separation between the data that you store with the workflow and then the data that the workflow is working on. So you get the data about the work from the workflow, and you get data about what is being worked on elsewhere. And then you use the process and task variables to tie them together. So for example, you would have an identifier for the object being worked on, but not, you know, the entire representation of the thing that, you know, data set or whatever that's being worked on. And one of the reasons for this is, even though it has the capability for you to store, you know, Java objects, serialize them into a variable in the workflow, that can lead to fragility. If you ever change that Java object, then it will be difficult to deserialize it again to get it out of the database. So you want to be careful that you maintain that separation as much as possible. So just to summarize, you know, what if you're looking for a workflow within LabKey, there are various different modules that you can use. If you are doing data processing, solely data processing, you probably are looking at the data integration or pipeline modules. And for that, you would define the extraction source, you define the transformation that you need to do, and you define the load target. If you have a human process where the process is codified in the brains of the humans, then you probably could use an issue tracker. And for that, you can use the standard issue tracker that just has a set of fields that we have found it useful as default, or you can define custom fields, and you will also define and populate lookup tables and lists for some of those custom fields, possibly. If you have something more complex than that, you want to combine data processing and human processing, then you probably want to look into the workflow module. And there you will define the process using some tool, define that XML document, and then probably you will want to add some custom UI for your human tasks that are particular to the type of object that's being worked on. And if you have system tasks, then you would need to add actions for those tasks as well.
Thank you all for attending. We did record this session, and it will be posted on the LabKey YouTube channel and on labkey.com. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.